I should do it the other way. Paul and I are taking Alex's initial invitation to this seminar at face value by presenting not so much a finished paper, but a few remarks stimulated by a recent discovery, and we're hoping that will feed into the research towards writing up that discovery, so we're looking for help from you. The new discovery itself comes at the end, unconventionally. Ever since Paul and I joined the team based at Durham working on the corpus of Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture in 1984, we've been making ourselves extremely unpopular with the editors by recording items that we believe fit into a period of stone sculpture that is chronologically post-conquest, but which nevertheless seems to derive its purpose and its kudos from Anglo-Saxon prototypes. We thought these monuments representative of a continuing tradition in Anglo-Saxon stone sculpture well into the Norman period. And on all three of our corpus volumes, you'll find an appendix catalogue documenting them and discussing them. Often these items are the remains of standing crosses in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, and we'll be focusing on examples of that type of monument in a moment. But the more general point we wanted to consider today is whether this imitation or interpretation of Anglo-Saxon artifacts during the century following the Norman conquest is purely a matter of aesthetic taste or of a slowly developing stylistic typology, both of which explanations have been offered, or even worse, the sad prospect offered by some scholars of elderly sculptors unable to forget their original training under Anglo-Saxon kings and completely incapable of responding to new instructions from Norman patrons. In fact, we feel dissatisfied with these sorts of explanations. We feel that this adherence to Anglo-Saxon ideas in chronologically post-conquest context deserves to be taken seriously as a phenomenon and at face value as an expression of the politics and sensibilities of the elite of post-conquest society. Indeed, we would suggest that it represents, at whatever remove, an echo of the claim made by the Norman kings and their elites to be legitimate successors of their Anglo-Saxon predecessors as kings, barons, or churchmen. We know that it mattered greatly to the early Norman kings, William I, William II, Henry I, Stephen, and Henry II, that they were seen as legitimate successors of the Anglo-Saxon royal house, represented by Edward the Confessor, of course, who was himself canonised by an admiring Henry II early in his reign. Henry II's efforts to obtain Edward's canonisation represent one small piece of evidence that the effort to fashion a link between the Norman kings and their Anglo-Saxon predecessors was not exclusively a matter of art history. So we feel this is not simply a debate about style criticism. And to emphasise that point, we perhaps start by considering the itinerary of the early Norman court and the architecture of power that that itinerary generated. Although there's been quite a bit of work done on the itinerary of the early Norman court, we want to focus particularly on Martin Biddle's important 1986 article about the major ceremony of crown wearing. Martin noted that William I and his successors down to Henry I were careful to arrange the court's itinerary and business in such a way that it always kept Christmas at Westminster and Easter at Winchester. And on those occasions, one of the celebratory feasts was the ceremony of crown wearing, where the king appeared formally attired in a tableau and in a procession at the head of his nobility. As Biddle notes, this ceremony at these specific locations was deliberately intended to evoke the itineraries and ceremonies of the Anglo-Saxon court, the late Anglo-Saxon court, in order to demonstrate that the Norman kings were legitimate successors to Edward the Confessor. Under Stephen, the barony were rarely willing to come together for great feasts at all, of course, and the custom of crown wearing fell into abeyance, though Stephen might have tried to revive it in Lincoln in 1141. It is clear, however, that the Anglo-Saxon tradition of crown-wearing feasting was deliberately revived at Christmas 1157 in Lincoln by the victorious Henry II. It's thought that he built an elaborate domestic complex, which we can still visit today at St Mary's Guildhall, which was focused on a first-floor hall in which the crown-wearing ceremony could take place. It's argued that the ceremony took place in the magnificent first-floor hall in the street range, which has a number of unusual architectural details that are best explained by this specific function. That's this long chamber you can see on the first floor on your left. But the question we want to raise today is whether the first floor hall layout here, and by extension perhaps those elsewhere, though that's rather a controversial statement, is intended to recall those elite first floor feasting halls of the Anglo-Saxons themselves, of which we hear much in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and which are depicted in the Bayeux tapestry. On the right there you've got Harold's feasting before embarking at Bosham. That's the Royal Hall at Bosham on the first floor. And if we think the building's design might be intended to evoke an Anglo-Saxon practice, can we push this analysis further perhaps by asking whether any visual parallel was intended between the elaborate foliage trails with which it is decorated, with which St Mary's Guildhall is decorated, and those which decorate so many Anglo-Saxon monuments, specifically carved wooden buildings, all lost in England. Are these sculptures also an attempted evocation of an Anglo-Saxon past? Although they are easily recognisable as sculptures in a Romanesque style and not in an Anglo-Saxon one. This building is notable for the very large number of these foliage trails that decorate almost every architectural feature. And you certainly don't see Henry II's other great secular buildings, the Keep at Dover or Newcastle or any of the others, decorated on the exterior in this lavish manner. So I think there might be a case for questioning what the intention was and setting that against the stylistic judgment of the date. One can make a case then that the erection of St Mary's Guildhall in the first place exemplifies Henry II's intention to evoke a major Anglo-Saxon political ceremony in order to reassert his crown's continuity with the Anglo-Saxon royal line of Edward the Confessor and thus lend it legitimacy. Perhaps the upper hall in his new purpose-built building can also be seen as a conscious reference to the famous setting of Anglo-Saxon feasts. And if the design of the building was intended to to evoke an Anglo-Saxon past, we can also legitimately ask whether the choice of decorative motifs were not also intended to evoke the Anglo-Saxon period, albeit that they are executed in a thoroughgoing Romanesque style. After all, it's possible that 12th century understandings of the Anglo-Saxon did not align exactly with modern art historical typologies. The debate about crown wearing can be thought of as revealing a continuity between the Anglo-Saxon and Norman sensibilities then. In our second example at Kirkstead Abbey, however, I want to suggest to you that the builders of the first Cistercian church here might have intended deliberately reviving certain Anglo-Saxon design features in order to manufacture a link between themselves and their Anglo-Saxon past. The Kirkstall Cistercian community arrived here in 1152, well documented, having been located at Barnoldswick since 1146. This new site was chosen, it seems, not just for practical reasons, but because it had previously been occupied by a band of hermits. And one might suggest that the place name Kirk, and the Kirk in the place name actually refers to the hermits and not to the Cistercian monastery. Of interest to our theme today is the fact that the building campaign begun in 1152 incorporated design features that are simply not found in the work of the same date at any other Cistercian houses of the same generation. Specifically, a number of the earliest architectural details in the church incorporate lengths of interlace clearly deriving from Anglo-Saxon prototypes, though apparently cut de novo here, so they're not reused stones. The most prominent of these details decorate one of the most significant ritual artifacts in the building, the elaborate early wall piscina that serves the high altar. These distinctive architectural details were first noticed long ago by J.T. Irving, and as he recognised, they require some specific explanation. Perhaps we should be seeing here, as we suggest, an example of the revival of Anglo-Saxon decorative forms in the 1150s in order to make a direct direct link between the incoming Cistercian monks and those hermits who, in whose care this site had been previously and whom they themselves had displaced. Here's another example of the replication of an Anglo-Saxon design in an Anglo-Norman monument, this time from Lincolnshire. The wapentake of Beltisloe in the hills north of Stamford has contained historically two churches of high status. The older of the two was that at Ednam, where there is not only pre-Viking fabric, but also the remains of this fine standing cross of the same period, and in the Northumbrian tradition with large hieratic figures. However, Ednam was given to Bridlington Priory on its foundation in 1120, following which it was without a resident lord and was served by curates. What had been a major Anglo-Saxon minster, therefore, became in the later medieval period a relatively uncelebrated parochial church. Meanwhile, whilst the church at Ednam was apparently declining as a centre of local religious significance, that at Castle Bytham, 5 miles away, was supplanting it. One sign of Castle Bytham's rising status was the church being granted to the monks of St Martin at O'Merle as a cell in 1115, recognising it as a suitable centre for the management of a large Norman monastic estate. Another sign of Castle Bytham's rising importance was probably its temporary occupation in 1147 by the Cistercian community who eventually colonised Vordy Abbey. By the 13th century, the church had become collegiate, containing 3 prebends. It seems likely that the rise of Castle Bytham Church to ecclesiastical prominence within the wapentake is related to the establishment of the castle itself, probably at the end of the 11th century, by Stephen, Earl of O'Marle. This background is relevant, we would suggest, to our proper understanding of the major 12th century monument at Castle Bytham. Here also there are 2 major cross shafts at the church, and we have in this part of the wapentake of Beltisloe 2 major churches, both of which have competing ambitions, and 2 comparable cross monuments, cross shafts. At Ednam, we have a fine example of a pre-Viking cross, with figures on its main face, probably also on the reverse, and with elaborate foliage trails along the sides. At Castle Bytham, on the other hand, the major shaft, undoubtedly of early 12th century date, seems to imitate some of the earlier decoration on the monument at Ednam. It has, for example, this elaborate foliage scroll that you can see in the image. Given the history of competition between these 2 ecclesiastical centres within the wapentake following the conquest, we suggest that the newly commissioned monument in Castle Bytham parish consciously imitates the early decoration on the cross standing in Ednam Parish Church graveyard. The wapentake's, which was the wapentake's former religious centre. As at Kirkstall, then, this imitation of Ednam at Castle Bytham would appear to be another case of the appropriation of the Anglo-Saxon past in order to acquire some contemporary status. Paul and I have been thinking about these issues lately during work on Cambridgeshire and the Soak for our next corpus volume. At Fletton in Northumberlandshire, we seem to have evidence both of the appearance of real Anglo-Saxon sculptures for contemporary political effect, and also imitation of Anglo-Saxon forms in Anglo-Norman sculptures to achieve the same aim. First, the real Anglo-Saxon sculpture. Fletton sits immediately south of Peterborough at the southern end of the ferry across the Nene, and it would easily have been seen from the Abbey Church. Yet it is outside the Soak, that ancient territory over which Peterborough claimed such extensive rights. In fact, Fletton was only obtained by the Abbey in the middle of the 11th century, but it was invested in greatly by Abbot Martin of Bec between 1133 and 1154, and became a key endowment of the cellarer. This fabric shows that during Abbot Martin's rule, the church was completely rebuilt and in a very lavish fashion. In particular, it was provided with the fine new chancel you see on the screen. As many of you will know, this chancel was decorated with a number of fragments of fine pre-Viking sculpture, which have long been thought to come from the Abbey church itself across the river. Inside, 2 full-length angels have been reset symmetrically in the south wall. Exactly how they related to the original decorative scheme of the chancel is not known, but it's surely very likely that they were part of it. Meanwhile, the fragments that are now re-erected behind the high altar, were originally, in the mid-12th century, mounted carefully on top of each other in the broad southeast buttress, as you can see in the bottom right. Evidently, none of these stones were reused casually. They have been carefully placed in these locations so that they would be seen and understood once the 12th century building was finished. Had they been considered merely as building materials, they would surely have been reused with their carved faces inwards. In fact, one can imagine the stones in the buttress being placed here as part of a dedication ceremony, intended to draw the attention to the fact that the new church was being built by the great abbey, which was itself the successor to 7th century Mead Hampstead, from which all the sculptures are presumed to have come. Consequently, the mid-12th century church building was being given a share of the kudos of Mead Hampstead by its new Norman owners. But at the same time, presumably somewhere nearby, sculptors were creating a stupendous new monument, also in the Anglo-Saxon manner, but again using decoration of undoubtedly Romanesque style. This is the so-called Rodolphus cross, which now stands on a modern base west of the tower. The fieldwork that Paul and I have done for the corpus at Fletton has revealed 3 further blocks from this same cross, permitting us to reconstruct a monument which stood originally considerably more than 4 meters tall. But more than that, some of the newly discovered pieces seem to emphasize how the shaft created in the middle of the 12th century is seeking to evoke standing shafts that were such a distinctive feature of pre-Viking monastic sites, especially in Northumbria. Not only are there plenty of interlacing foliage trails, but we were particularly struck by the similarities between this inscription panel on the bottom right and those on certain classic 7th century shafts, such as Bewcastle here. Even so, one could not mistake the roundels or the leaf sculpture on this Fletton monument for Anglo-Saxon work. This is an imitation of an Anglo-Saxon monument in the Anglo-Norman stylistic idiom. For various internal archaeological reasons, we suspect that this huge monument stood in the open until at least the late Middle Ages, presumably in a public space. We see no reason to distinguish it in date from the date of the reconstruction of Fletton Church itself, i.e. in the 2nd quarter of the 12th century. Furthermore, we suggest that the explanation for both monuments can be understood in the context of major alterations to the local topography undertaken by Abbot Martin. Original access to Peterborough Abbey from the south was via a ferry from Stanground. However, the ferry across the Nene here, I hope you can read the map on the bottom left, the ferry across the Nene here at Stanground leading towards the original secular settlement at Peterborough called Boongate, east of the cathedral, belonged not to Peterborough Abbey but to Thorney Abbey, its nearby rival. And the documentary record shows that the 2 abbeys fought like children over the control of this approach route, with Peterborough constantly demanding the right of themselves and their tenants to use the Stanground ferry for free. However, according to the contemporary chronicle of Hugh Candidus, Abbot Martin of Beck cut this Gordian knot by relocating the entire secular settlement of Peterborough from Boongate, outside the Abbey's east gate, and to a position opposite the ferry from Stanground, and close to the Abbey's west gate, opposite a new ferry that he created at Fletton. You can see in the road pattern how the approach road now swings westwards, south of Stanground. There we are. This is the approach road, that was the original ferry, and the road now swings westwards through Fletton to the west of the Abbey precinct. We suggest that Abbot Martin, can commission this tall, high cross to indicate the new Fletton ferry, landing somewhere to the north of the church. But as with the newly constructed church at Fletton, Martin was keen to associate his new ferry with the ancient past of his monastery. Thus, although it is undoubtedly a cross of the second quarter of the 12th century, it is, in certain of its details, an imitation of the Northumbrian high crosses of Bede's time. In the mid-12th century at Fletton, then, we find both real Anglo-Saxon artefacts being used to appropriate the kudos of the Anglo-Saxon past, and also the creation of new monuments immediately adjacent, designed in an Anglo-Saxon idiom to make the same point. Thank you.